Now, the two-day G20 summit has concluded in New Delhi. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has handed over the presidency to Brazil. Leaders present at the G20 summit in New Delhi adopted a consensus declaration as they made commitments on several issues, ranging from food and energy security to climate change. And in the summit, which was themed One Earth, One Family, One Future, global leaders vowed to act in concrete ways through partnerships, and that will result into a strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth. The summit started with the inclusion of African Union as a permanent member of the grouping of world's largest economies. And by doing so, the leaders hope that the African Union will provide a wider stage to Global South within the G20. Right after this, the joint declaration was adopted. Now, an agreement on the toned-down language while mentioning the war in Ukraine and dropping any references to criticize Russia for the same established India's role as an efficient arbitrator. India says it used the G20 presidency to focus on the needs and aspirations of countries of the Global South. The next notable outcome of the summit is the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor. Touted as an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative, the deal aims to set up rail and port links between West Asia and South Asia and eventually to Europe. The plan is to lay railway lines in West Asia and connecting them to India by ports. Meanwhile, on the sidelines of the summit, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni said that there is more to Italy-China relations than the BRI, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, while adding that the decision to pull out of BRI is still to be taken. Moving on to another concern, and that is climate change. The Delhi Declaration vows to phase down and not phase out coal-based power. The G20 leaders also agreed to triple renewable energy capacity globally by 2030, and this even as countries like France said that more could have been done in respect to climate change. The leaders' stance during the summit was closely watched before the COP28 UN Climate Summit in UAE. Meanwhile, World Bank President Ajay Banga said that the G20 Delhi Declaration will help in bringing reforms and redefine the vision of the bank.
And the declaration has got many good parts to it. Selfishly, it has a great deal to do with the multilateral banks, which is good for me because it gives me the wind in my sails for me to keep pushing for reform and getting the bank to work better. That's the way I think about it.
There's no missing out also on India's soft diplomacy visible at the G20 summit. The visit of G20 leaders to the memorial to Mahatma Gandhi at Rajghat created a family photo opportunity that had been denied before. The G20 also proved a platform to showcase its cultural traditions at multiple levels. Now, as the G20 summit comes to a successful end, our principal diplomatic correspondent Siddhant Sibul sent us a report from the ground.
Well, the two-day G20 summit has concluded here in the Indian national capital, and India has emerged as a major diplomatic force at the world stage. Now, the two key outcomes of the G20 summit here in Delhi, first was the joint statement, given that many were believing that it will not come given the divergent views, especially when it comes to the G7 and Russia and China on the other side. Also a new para on Ukraine, something that all the sides are agreeable on, consensus also on other issues from climate to cryptocurrency. The second, of course, is inclusion of African Union at the high table. That is the inclusion of African Union when it comes to the G20 grouping happening here under the Indian presidency, which also showcases New Delhi's priorities towards Africa, something that we will see in next few months as well. But essentially an important summit, that gives an important Indian imprint on global governance architecture.
Now, to decode this two-day summit further, we are being joined by Ambassador Leela Punappa from New Delhi. She is a former Indian diplomat and former Deputy National Security Advisor and Secretary, National Security Council Secretariat. Welcome to the broadcast, ma'am.
Thank you.
Now that the G20 summit has concluded with a 100% consensus on the declaration, where do you think this puts India on the global stage?
India has always been too large and too important a country to ignore. And ever since independence, when there was an articulated vision of India's role in Asia, and the Asia Relations Conference took place in Delhi even before independence, I think India saw for itself a role in the larger committee of nations. Even though we hadn't yet been independent, we signed the UN Charter and have been very important players in the entire UN process ever since then, and in particular with regard to the contribution of our peacekeeping forces in various places. Now, the G20 summit has taken place at a time when, in many ways, you could say India's time has come because our economy has grown. I think the learning curve that we've had as a nation with regard to the management of ourselves, economically, socially, politically, with all the many challenges before us, are something that the world has recognized. And we've been members of the G20 from the outset. In fact, it's important that we recognize what the G20 represents. There has been a dissatisfaction with the functioning of the UN system over the past several decades, because the structure of the United Nations was set up after World War II. Times have changed. There are many countries that have grown in terms of population, in terms of capabilities. Certainly, India is one of those. And the demand for the reform of the international institutions, whether the United Nations or the financial institutions, the Bretton Woods twins, has been taking place for some time. Now, as a result of that, you've had the growth of many other multilateral organizations which are trying to seek solutions. And in one way, the G20 has also been a quest for an effective multilateral organization which recognizes the more active and growing economies of the world, in addition to those that are considered developed countries, and to try to get more effective decision-making, particularly in the management of the global financial structure, although the agenda has grown immensely since G20 was established.
Right. You said that the times have changed. So taking that point a little further, in a press briefing yesterday, the Indian Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman had said that one-size-fits-all technique cannot be a solution. She was speaking in respect to climate change back then, but this has been a recurring point India has been making in respect to other issues as well, that since challenges are different, solutions cannot be the same. I want to ask you, how do you assess this new thought process when it comes to an economic forum like the G20?
Well, if you take a look at the respective declarations from the very start, from the November 2008 summit that took place in Washington, issues of developmental funding have been an intrinsic part of the dialogue. Of course, the declaration in 2008 was, I think, just all of 12 pages with nothing added to it. And the declarations have since grown in volume. But the whole aspect of sustainable funding for development, for the relief of debt, for the management of debt, particularly among developing countries of global south, if you wish to call it that way, we have engaged the participants, not just in the G20, but in all other developmental fora. So I think this is a key part of anything that the G20 has to do. So it's, I think, entirely appropriate that the finance minister made a mention of it.
All right, before I let you go, Ambassador, in your eyes, was this summit a success?
Yes, indeed it was. But it is not the end of the road. Please look at it as a process. There were summits before. There will be summits in future. But I think in many ways, if you look at it as an event, certainly I think the organization was meticulous. And I know how hard it is even just for protocol and security to organize one state visit. But when you have so many heads of state and government in town, as well as heads of multilateral organizations, the logistics are enormous. And if one small thing goes wrong, believe me, it can skewer the whole thing. So people have worked very hard at that. That's in terms of the event. In terms of the process, I don't just look at it as one event of the past 2 days, but really of the work that has taken place in the past year. And it's important that our viewers understand what G20 is about. It's not just about bringing together all these important people and having a big show, in effect, but the work that has taken place under the different working groups of the Sherpa track and the finance track. The Sherpa track is led by the Prime Minister Sherpa, or the head of government Sherpa. The finance track is led by the finance minister and the governors of the central bank of the respective country. Each of these has working groups. The Sherpa track, in addition, also has what they call initiatives. And one of the key initiatives this time was bringing the principal scientific advisors together for pooling findings on research. Both tracks have what are called engagement groups, which are in effect non-governmental. It's not just officials who meet, but civil society also gets together under a whole lot of agenda items involving labor, involving culture, involving empowerment, skill development, and so on. And a very interesting one this time, an initiative, was with regard to startups. That was an Indian proposal. So this was the process, and I do believe a lot of effort was put in over there. And then, of course, you have the implications of where is this going to take us. The G20 does not function in isolation. All the members are members of the United Nations. They are members of many other, both multilateral and regional commitments are made. And the declarations often draw on the decisions of those organizations as well. So this is work in progress, but something has been achieved. And as I said, they will have to build on what has been.
Oh, absolutely. You make a fair point there. The words have been put on the paper. Now the road ahead is absolutely crucial, where the actual work will take place. Thank you for speaking with us, Ambassador Punappa, and getting us all those insights. It was a pleasure speaking to you.